Today we're looking at the mind versus the brain and how neurosurgeons are beginning to say that the mind is more than the brain. And we're going to be taking a look at one in specific today. This is one of those instances how I've been telling you guys that I want to keep you updated about news and science where they are getting ever so close to what we have been saying for years. So today we're going to be taking a look at evidence for the non-physical within neuroscience and what a neurosurgeon himself has to say on the topic. It's going to be good. So neurosurgeon Michael Egnor talks about how many famous neuroscientists became dualists. That is, they concluded that there is something about human beings that go beyond matter based on observations they made during their work. Now, real quick, I want to say that our position is not a position of dualism. So what is dualism? Dualism says that there are two substances, mind and matter. And no serious philosopher takes this position seriously because it is fallacious and impossible. It's known as the interaction problem, Cartesian substance dualism. If you have two substances that are completely different and don't share any common properties, it's impossible for them to be able to interact. However, this is a neurosurgeon and not a philosopher, so they're probably not aware of the fact that dualism is a fallacious position, and since they're probably not very familiar or well versed in philosophy, what basically the neurosurgeon is saying is that there is something more than matter, and that's exactly what it says in this particular article. That is, they concluded that there is something about human beings that go beyond matter, that go beyond the physical, based on observations they made during their work. So it's important to note that as we talk about different surgeries that are taking place, that the brain doesn't experience pain. So a neurosurgery patient can comfortably remain conscious with only local anesthetic, and the surgeon can communicate with the patient to be sure that the treatment is not damaging speech or movement. So as we go along and read about some of these surgeries, while the surgeon is working on the person's brain, the person will be awake and the neurosurgeon can communicate with them. So Michael Egnor, this neurosurgeon, started his career as a materialist. He started his career believing that everything was matter and nothing besides. And this is how most neurosurgeons start. This is how most people interested in the physical sciences of any kind or whatnot, most people today begin as materialists. That's sort of the current paradigm that we live in, that the world is made of matter and nothing at all. He thought the whole mind came from the brain and he was just going to study it. And this is an issue that we come across in Hyperianism all the time, is that most people think that the mind and the brain are synonymous, that the brain is the mind and the mind is the brain. And this is actually more of a recent idea with the advent of materialism. This has not always been the case, this idea. But as we'll see, this is the position that this particular neurosurgeon started with. He thought the mind was the brain and the brain was the mind. So by becoming a neurosurgeon, I'm going to study the brain, therefore I'll be studying the mind. At the end of his career, 30 years later, he was a passionate dualist, meaning that he thinks that there is more to reality, more to the brain, or more to the mind than just the physical or the brain. He said that there is a part of the mind that is not from the brain. He had several lines of reasoning that convinced him of that. We're going to look at why he thought that, what changed his mind. Now, real quick, I want to give you, for those who are new, our position in Hyperianism is what's known as idealism. It's not dualism, it's not panpsychism, it's idealism, which means in Hyperion philosophy, everything is mind, and mind generates the illusion of matter, just like a dream. When you go to sleep and dream, your dream world seems very real and very physical. However, it's ultimately a projection of mind. So, in Hyperionism, what occurs is that a mind is a soul, if we want to use religious terminology. But remember, we don't subscribe to faith or mysticism or anything like that. We are a system of logic, reason, and mathematics. So a mind, an eternal mind, a monad, or a soul is a very well-defined mathematical object that is a set of Fourier basis waves, frequencies, sinusoidal patterns. So what happens in Hyperionism is that the mind links to a body, and a brain is sort of a control mechanism. It's a filtering and control mechanism. And an easy analogy to understand this is pretend like you're playing a video game. So you're sitting on a couch and you're holding a controller and you're watching a TV screen. And on the TV screen is a game world, and a character that you control, your game character, your avatar. And the controller that you're holding is what allows you to control the game character in the game. You sit outside of the game, but the game controller serves as a link between you, the entity outside the game, and your game character in the game. So, in this loose analogy, in Hyperionism, you are a mind, an eternal mind, a monad, a soul, and the brain is a bit like the video game controller that allows you to link to and control the character in the game, or your body in the space-time universe, the space-time holos. So, keep that in mind as we continue to read, because I'll be showing you exactly what Dr. Egnor's surgical explorations showed and how that links up to Hyperionism. So one line of reasoning was that in mapping people's brains, and again, he mapped upwards of 1,000 people this way, 1,000 people. He would hundreds of individual simulations of the surface of the brain to see what happened. And people would have all sorts of things happen. They would have their arm move, or they would feel a tingle, or they would see a flash. So he's doing surgery on people's brain, he's mapping out people's brains, and he's doing different things, different stimulus, and different things would happen. They might feel a tingling sensation, or their arm might move, or they would see a flash of light, or sometimes they'd have a memory, or they would have an impediment. Sometimes they couldn't speak for a minute or two after a certain part of the brain was touched. But Penfield noted that in probably hundreds of thousands of different individual simulations, he never once simulated the power of reason. He never once stimulated the intellect. He never stimulated a person to do calculus or to think of an abstract concept like justice or mercy. All the stimulations were concrete things. Move your arm, or feel a tingling, or even a concrete memory, but there was never an abstract thought stimulated. So this is really important. What we're seeing here is that through these different stimulations of the brain, they're always concrete things. A movement of the arm, a feeling, a tingling. But never could the faculty of reason or abstract thought be stimulated. Now, why is that? If the mind is just the brain, then stimulating the brain should be able to produce every sort of phenomenon that is possible. But here's the thing. Let's go back to Hyperianism and the video game and controller analogy. If the game controller is like the brain, if you do experiments on the game controller, guess what you're going to be able to do? Well, you'll mash buttons, and that'll make the game character move in erratic ways, right? If you start stimulating the game controller, yeah, it's going to make the game character start walking in a weird direction, or their arm will move. But you won't be able to get the game character to behave in a rational way. Because the rationality, the rational generator isn't coming from the controller. The source of reason, of mind, of abstract thought is coming from the thing that controls the controller. And likewise, in Hyperianism, reasoning is what is coming from the eternal mind, the monad, not the brain. The eternal mind, or the monad, uses the brain as a control mechanism through which it can express rational pattern. But just like a video game and a video game controller, if you stimulate the brain, yeah, it'll make erratic movements, but it will never generate reason or abstract thinking. Yeah, someone's arm might move, but they're not suddenly going to start doing calculus because you stimulate a part of their brain. You know, likewise, again, think about a video game controller. If you start stimulating that video game controller randomly, you're just mashing buttons, and the game character is going to move in a bunch of ways. But that game character is not going to exhibit rational patterns. It's only when you give the controller to the one who controls the controller that then it can start manipulating that game character in a certain way that does exhibit reason. Penfield said, hey, if the brain is the source of abstract thought, once in a while, putting an electrical current on some part of the cortex ought to get an abstract thought. If the brain and the mind are the same thing, then if you start to stimulate the brain, you should get every response that the mind is capable of, at least once in a while, such as an abstract thought. But he never, ever did. So he said that the obvious explanation for that is that abstract thought doesn't come from the brain. And this is perfectly in line with Hyperianism, in that the brain is just the link between the mind and the body, between the monad and the body. Reason, abstract reasoning, and thought, that comes from the monad. The brain is just a link in the connection that allows the monad to express itself within the physical world. Just like a video game controller is what allows you to express yourself in the video game world via your video game avatar. So Michael Egnor says the other line of reasoning that he had, which is kind of related to this, is that since he was a pioneer in the treatment of epilepsy, not only did he study the surgical manifestations of epilepsy, but he also studied the presentation of seizures that people would have in their everyday life. So he studied hundreds of thousands of seizures that people had, and he never found any seizure that had intellectual content. Seizures never involved abstract reasoning. When people have seizures, sometimes they have a generalized seizure. Sometimes they just fall on the ground and go unconscious. Or sometimes they'll have what's called a focal seizure, where they have a twitching of a finger or a twitching of a limb, or they'll have a tingling feeling. The same kind of things that he got when he stimulated the surface of the brain. But nobody ever had a calculus seizure. No one just starts suddenly doing calculus. Nobody ever had a seizure where they couldn't stop doing arithmetic or couldn't stop doing logic. And he said, why is that? That that might sound kind of silly to us, but stop and think about why it sounds silly. Why? Why? If arithmetic and logic and abstract thought come from the brain, then every once in a while you ought to get a seizure that makes that happen. So he asked rhetorically, why are there no intellectual seizures? His answer was because the intellect doesn't come from the brain. Same thing in Hyperianism. The intellect doesn't come from the brain. The intellect comes from the monadic mind, and the brain serves as the link from the monadic mind to the physical body. Just like if you're playing a video game, you can make your avatar in the video game behave in intellectual ways. You have to be able to fight dragons and go on quests and make trades. But the intellect of your game character isn't coming from the controller. You use the controller to express the intellect through your game character. And so if you stimulating different parts of the brain is sort of like just mashing buttons on the controller. If you start mashing buttons on the controller, you're not going to get that game character to behave in exhibit an intellect. It only exhibits an intellect because an intellect is controlling it. Same thing with your body. Your body only is able to engage in intellectual behavior. You're only able to grab a pen and pencil and start doing calculus because you as a monadic mind are expressing itself through the brain and the body. Your ability to do calculus doesn't come from the brain. It's facilitated by the brain. Now, it's in a very important part. Don't get me wrong. It's extremely important. Just like the game controller is important for your game. Remove the game controller, you no longer have any link and ability to express yourself in the game. Remove your brain or take a chunk out of the brain, you're going to have a hard time doing anything because you've removed your link. But it doesn't come from the brain. His third line of reasoning was the following. And this is very cool. This is extremely fascinating. He would ask people to move their arm during the surgery. So he'd be playing around with their brain. And he said, whenever you want to, move your right arm. And so the person would move their arm. And once in a while, he'd stimulate the part of the brain that made the arm move. So he would ask people to move their right arm every once in a while, and then he himself would stimulate part of their brain to make their arm move. And they would move their arm when he did that. And then he would ask them, I want you to tell me when I'm making your arm move and when you're making your arm move without me making you do it. And tell me if you can tell the difference. And the patients could always tell the difference. The patients always knew when the neurosurgeon stimulated their arm, when it was him doing it, and not them. When they stimulated their arm, they were doing it, not him. So Penfield said he couldn't stimulate the will. He could never trick the patients into thinking it was them doing it. He said the patients always retained a correct sense of agency. They always know if they did it or if he did it. So he said the will was not something he could stimulate, meaning it was not material. So he had 3 lines of evidence. But basically I want to point this out first here though, that this is extremely important. The patients could always tell if they were the ones moving their arm or if the doctor stimulating their brain was making them move their arm. And no matter what the doctor did, he couldn't stimulate the will. He could never trick them. And if the brain is just the mind, the question is, why is that? Why is that the case? Again, think about in our system of Hyperianism, that makes perfect sense. If the brain is just a controller, like a video game controller, it makes perfect sense. You know if you're the one pushing the A button, and you know if someone else, the doctor, is the one pushing the A button. You know, the doctor, someone else isn't going to push the A button and go, hey, can you tell who's the one pushing the button right now? And you go, no, obviously you are. I'm not. I didn't will it. I didn't push it, you did. So you see, the brain is this link, it's this controller, it's this mechanism, it's this interface. The brain is the interface between mind and so-called matter. Now, to be clear, in Hyperianism, matter is just transformed mind, but I don't want to get into those details right now. But the brain is just an interface. The brain is an interface between the material world and you as an immaterial mind, just as a video game controller is the interface between you and the video game world. And so, you cannot stimulate the intellect, and you cannot stimulate the will. And this makes perfect sense when you understand that that's because, hey, the mind isn't the brain. They're two different things. However, it doesn't make any sense when you're coming from a materialist point of view. From a materialist point of view, if the brain is just the mind, and the mind is just the brain, by stimulating it, of course you should be able to stimulate the will and stimulate the intellect. But that never happens. And that makes no sense at all in the materialist paradigm, but perfect sense in the Hyperion, idealist, and ontological mathematical paradigm. So he had 3 lines of evidence: his inability to stimulate intellectual thought, the inability of seizures to cause intellectual thought, and his inability to stimulate the will. So he concluded that the intellect and the will are not from the brain. And we're seeing many neurosurgeons come to this conclusion. And this is what we have been saying. We define the eternal monadic mind, the soul, as being a system of reason, and will is just unconscious reasoning. The will is unconscious reasoning, and something like calculus and abstract thought, that's conscious reasoning. But reason, as we have defined a mind to be a system of reason, a system of mathematical thought, mathematical pattern, is what links to a brain and is then able to express itself in the physical world. And so it makes perfect sense, and this is what we have been saying for years. And we're just now, again, seeing neuroscience slowly beginning to catch up with this as they do their experiments and see that, oh yeah, well, by stimulating the brain, we can do all sorts of things with the body. We can make the arm move, we can make people see a flash of light. But we can't get them to use intellectual reasoning. We can't get abstract thought to occur. We can't get the will to occur. Very strange. Why is that? That's because the will and intellectual thought is not part of the brain. Just like intellectual reasoning and will is not part of the game controller. So you have a game controller. What do you have to do to the game controller? You have to apply intellectual thought and will to the game controller to make the game character move in a coherent way. That's what you're doing. That's what when you pick up a controller, what are you doing to it? You're applying thought and will to it. You have a will. There's something you want to do, something you want to make the character do, and what you want to make the character do is facilitated by your reason. And the controller is the interface, the link between your reason and will and the game character in the game world. Same thing in Hyperianism. Same thing in ontological mathematics. You are not your body, and you are not your brain. You are an eternal monadic mind, a system of thought, and the brain is the interface that allows you, as a frequency function, to interact with the space-time function of your body. Just like in a game world. But of course, on a much higher level. So what I really want to get across, again, by showing you all these different articles, is that these are things that we have been saying for years. And day after day, I just want to keep you guys up to date with how the sciences are slowly, at a snail's pace, getting closer and closer and closer to what we've been saying. But this isn't any kind of dualism. Cartesian dualism is false because of the interaction problem. This isn't any kind of panpsychism. This isn't any kind of simulated reality. This is a mathematical idealism. This is a mental reality, a system of thoughts. And this world that we live in is a projection of frequency patterns. In other words, it's a shared collective dream that we're all having right now, facilitated by the power of mathematics. We are it. We are the new science. We are the new future. So it's time to ditch these old, what do you want to be? Do you want to be on the side of the slow inching snail's pace of the current paradigm? Or do you want to be a part of the new revolution of thought where we are light years ahead of the game and we know where it's at? We know what reality is, what we are, and what existence is. And how do we know that? By the power of reason. And what's our goal? To change the world and transform humanity. And how will we do that? Through our will. So through our reason and through our will, powers that are beyond the material and beyond the brain, that is how we will transform the world, transform ourselves, and transform the universe. A big shout out to all our supporters on Patreon, especially our top supporters, White Rabbit, John, Rex, and Neruda, and all our top supporters. You guys are awesome. Thanks so much for supporting my work and making what I do possible. If you enjoy my work, consider supporting on Patreon, and hey, you'll get access to our weekly secret live streams. They're a lot of fun.